Hello everybody, and thank you for attending the CREST intelligence-led penetration testing presentations for today. We are now on our last webinar of the day, which is very sad because they've been incredibly interesting, and I'm sure this one will live up to the standard of today. It's being given by Jason Smart of PwC, and it's with regards to APT using COVID content for targeted attacks. So I will hand over to Jason very shortly, but just before we do, for those of you that have been on a GoToWebinar before, you know there is a button with questions, and you can put your questions in that question pane. Jason will allow a short time at the end to answer some of those questions, so please feel free to type them in there and make sure we can get as many asked of Jason before the end of the webinar. So thank you very much for everybody that's come on board, and now I'll hand over to you, Jason. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. Well, afternoon, everybody. Good morning for those joining from the States and overseas. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is how, some of the campaigns that we've been seeing that are using COVID as a Lua document or as a way of gaining access to it. We see a fair amount of campaigns. We've got an intel team at PwC that tracks a significant amount of threat actors, and some of the Luas we were seeing were quite interesting. So I figured it might actually be an interesting way to go through and talk through some of the things we've been seeing. So what I'll do is as I go through this, I'll talk about the threat actor, go through the Luas, but then I'll also break it down into an attack chain. It's a similar way to how PwC ourselves do things for CBEST or for CREST engagements. So you get that nice flow of the attack scenarios. But first things, let's go with next slide. Cool. So who am I? So I'm Jason. I run the technical side of PwC's threat intelligence team. I sit in London. I work for a gentleman called Chris McConkey. My job is to essentially handle all of our technical collection, our methodology for analysis, so reverse engineering techniques, infrastructure tracking techniques, and to really make sure that the cohort of reverse engineers that work for us have the right data, the right tools, and the right access they need to go and track all these threat actors so we can protect our clients. I'm also a CCTIM, so I handle all of PwC's CREST certified threat intel kind of engagement, so you think CBEST, etc. And I sit on the CREST Threat Intelligence Professional Subcommittee, so with Rob Dartnell and Ollie Church and all those others esteemed gentlemen. So I've got a real long background in this. Before doing working for PwC, I used to work for CrowdStrike, and before that for the Australian government doing threat intel for them as well. So I've been doing this for about 10 years. So what I'm hoping to take you through today is a list of who's who of some threat actors. So we'll start off with a North Korean based threat actor. We'll jump around to Russia, some China based threat actors, some Vietnamese based threat actors, and then kind of lastly finish on the subcontinent with India and Pakistan. I will just quickly say, you'll hear me say North Korea based, etc. We try and avoid pivoting down to particular countries, etc. We basically go where the threat actor is, where we think they're operating out of where they're based. All right, so for the first one, as I said, we'll jump into some North Korea. So the first actor here is a group called Black Banshee. Now, for those playing at home, this one is a threat actor we call, Black Banshee, but is known as Kim Suki, Velvet Khmer. I always mess that one up, but that's the CrowdStrike name for it. We know they like to target, the United Kingdom, Japan, United States, South Korea, anything in that region. They'll be pretty much interested in, from a targeting sectors. We're talking aerospace, automotive, defense, education, etc. Most recently we've seen them go after healthcare, pharmaceuticals, and I'll dive into that in a second. These are a really interesting threat actor because they have, two motivations. So at PwC, we group things by motivation. So whether that be espionage motivated, cybercrime motivated, activism or sabotage. In this case, Black Banshee is traditionally an espionage motivated, but they will also go after cybercrime. They've got to fund themselves somehow, I imagine. So jumping into this one, this is more of an infrastructure one rather than a document Lua malware type approach, but it's still really interesting and it's really topical. There are some new domains in the last 24 hours that are pretty interesting and targeting some recent organizations that have published some vaccine data. But going back to this particular instance, so we were observing a bunch of domains being created. We've got a really cool system at PwC that tracks domain registrations, and we can put in some keywords that we want to keep an eye on. So early on into COVID, we jumped on and popped in anything to do with COVID, anything to do with pharmaceutical companies. When some of the leading pharmaceutical companies started to talk about that, we dropped their names in. So we've got stuff for AstraZeneca and a few others. We also have detection rules for World Health Organization. And as we were going through this, we saw some domains get registered, but we also did this the old-fashioned way, where we were tracking IP addresses that we know the threat actor is known to use and going from there. And so when we're looking at this, we're like, oh, that's pretty interesting. We started seeing some whoint.cf and whoint.ml, and then pivoting around on some of those IP addresses, we saw a lot more of them. So AstraZeneca popped up, or AstraZeneca as the typo is. Novavax, so Novavax is a US-based vaccine company. Boyoung is a South Korean pharmaceutical company, and Cellatron is also a South Korean pharmaceutical company. So all of these are fairly topical. World Health is doing a lot on this front, and all of these pharmaceutical companies are, in the process of creating some vaccines. So, I can totally see why a North Korean-based threat actor might be interested in some of these entities. We didn't see any of the particular phishing emails, but if I had to take a guess, it's either going to be, it'll be a spear phishing email with a link to take them to a credential phishing website. That's pretty much their standard MO at the moment. We do see them deploy spear phishing with malware, but for when it comes to some of these domains, we typically will see it as a cred phishing. So that was really interesting, and that's kind of like the first real impactful one. So jumping around now, we'll quickly have a look at some Russia-based threat actors, and in particular, I'm going to focus on one that is, fairly common. It specifically only generally targets the Ukraine. In this case, Blue Otso, so Gamma Radon, Reuse, Armageddon, etc. That's their other names. They, as I said, target Ukraine. We've seen them target Hungary and a few other places, but primarily it's anything to do with, the Ukraine special missions, etc. They are primarily after aerospace defense or government, and we would definitely class these guys as espionage. They're completely looking for any information that can support, intelligence gathering. So, we titled the report for this one "Super Spreader" because this campaign went on for months. We were seeing them sending anything to do with COVID or those lures for a long time. The general theme of it would be they'd send a lure document, very much like the one on screen at the moment. This covers. It's recommendations that somebody needs to put in place for COVID, and it was sent to the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. So that's just one of them. There are other ones around that. A lot of their targeting that Blue Otso do is around the OCSC, so the special monitoring mission they've got out there, plus targeting of the security service of Ukraine. So it's a fairly straightforward targeting list. Now, how this looked for the actual attack chain itself is pretty interesting. So what we've got is Blue Otso steps through. These guys typically will use a remote word template. So they'll set the document up and basically say, well, when you open this document, enable macros, etc. All that. The first thing it actually does is it calls out to a remote template, so a ... and downloads that, and that's actually got the malicious macro in it. So they'll package that up and send it off, and normally they'll send it to maybe 1, maybe 3 or 4 people, and the target's pretty specific. They're looking for people who are going to have access to some of the intelligence they need. So it'll be, if they're targeting SBU, it'll be SBU officials. If it's somebody in the Defense Department, they'll go after that. So what happens next is the victim or the target will open that document, and then there'll be a little bit of comms going back out. So in this case, they reached out to a fairly malicious domain, myftp.biz, with this .dot file. Now, this .dot file has a couple of interesting, some Easter eggs in it. If you aren't coming from the right location in the world, you will get a different file, and that file will contain some Easter eggs to the extent of, normally they're quite vulgar images. Some of them will be like communist propaganda type stuff. Other ones will be, people putting their middle finger up, etc. And we've kind of always taken the position that that's the threat actor, having a bit of a go at the security research industry, who's going away and finding all of their documents, etc. What would happen if you actually got the original one, the legitimate one? So you'd get this .dot file, have an embedded macro, and as soon as that downloads, it runs. And what it does is it does two things. The first bit is it writes out playlist.vbs to media player. I don't know anybody who actually uses media player anymore, but beside the point. And it'll also schedule a task, and that task will run at about 95 minutes. And so after 95 minutes, the scheduled task runs, it executes playlist.vbs, and then it steps into the next stage. So the first bit of that is, first of all, it goes off and kills a bunch of tools. So if you're running IDA, Wireshark, any kind of debugger, some AV tools as well, it goes off and tries to kill those processes. At the same time as it's doing that, it's enumerating through system information, so getting things like usernames, host name, etc. And what it's doing is it's sending that off to the C2 server at the 3utilities.com. The 3utilities is a pretty well-known Otso domain. They've got a few others hosted on that, and one of the really interesting things about Otso is if you can get to their C2 servers and pivot down to the IP addresses behind them, well, they're what I call a bit of a graveyard, and that you get one, you generally tend to get the rest of their infrastructure. So from here, we pretty much be able to map out most of their infrastructure for at least 2-3 years, which is really handy. So that's kind of the first attack chain. That's how we tend to map things out on our side when we're looking at them. What I'll do now is I'll jump to some really interesting Chinese sets and talk first of all about Red Orthrus. So these guys are better known as Keyboy, Pirate Panda, APT 23. They're mostly interested in, previously it was the United States, Philippines, and at the moment we're kind of seeing most of it as being like Mongolia, Hong Kong, Vietnam, so near abroad for a threat actor that's based out of China. Target sectors are anything defense, dissident related, government, media, anything NGO. And these guys are definitely, as the previous actor is, they're after espionage. They want intelligence. They want to know what's going on. So some of you might be familiar with this 8.t builder. Now we've got about, I want to say 7 to 8 threat actors that use 8.t to build their malicious documents. I kind of class the threat actors who use 8.t as more in that, low to medium sophistication. They're certainly not up there with like the Winties and the Shadowpads of the world, but they're still effective, right? I mean, I guess that's all you really do need to be, is if you can build, you got a solid builder, then you can get through and deploy malicious documents quite easy. But in any case, we saw Red Orthrus using a document that was COVID themed. In this case, it was back in the good old days when 683 infected was a high number. Unfortunately, the reality of that is vastly different at the moment. In any case, this particular document was, when we looked at the Lua and itself and some of the metadata around that, we were able to pick out an author. Now, normally 8.t builders will strip back the author, or they'll be like user or admin, etc. In this case, it appears the threat actor had left the original author's name in there. And so the author field there is this person is likely a researcher out of the Mongolian National University. Having a quick look at some of their profile online, they work on public health profiles for the WHO. So it makes sense that they probably stole this document to weaponize it. So that's really the lure. In the past, we've seen them target defense and a few other places, but we didn't really get to see the actual email that was used on it. But if I had to hazard a guess, I would probably say it was going after anything Department of Health type related for Mongolia. So if we step through what this looks like and have a look at what malware eventually ends up getting dropped, and in this case it's a poison ivy binary. But if we jump through, so we see them collect their document, they weaponize it using 8.t. In this case, they use the CV 2018 0798, which results in basically a buffer overflow that runs shellcode. So, they document that up, send it over in a spear phishing email. Victim opens the document. As I said, the document, they enable macros that triggers the CVE, which drops a buffer overflow. That then leads to some shellcode. And at this point, the shellcode writes out 8.t, a file called 8.t into the temp folder, which is where 8.t gets its name. Basically, anytime you see that, it should drop it out as to 8.t. There's been a couple of variations on that in some other lures, but that seems to be where a threat actor is kind of modifying the builder for their own purposes. So this one's a pretty straightforward chain of events. There's really nothing sophisticated about it. It writes it out, a.t, and then it drops and rewrites that as world function.dll. Once that's run, so they've gained execution, all they do is communicate to a C2 server. Now, this 95, 179, 131 was previously used back in 2019 to target Mongolian news agencies and other government agencies. So Red Orthrus is just reusing some of their infrastructure. So that's a really nice chain. We were able to see some traffic to this and kind of work out that at least there was 1 or 2 victims, but we were never able to actually work out who in Mongolia was infected there. So unfortunately, kind of lose some of the track there. So the second Chinese threat actor I want to talk about is Red Hariasa. This is Chinoxy. Now, Red Hariasa is one of those threat actors that we see a lot, but unfortunately, it's also one that seems to be overlaps with a lot of other threat actors. We occasionally will go looking for some other Chinese threat actors and end up at a Hariasa binary or a domain, and it's kind of like, well, how do we keep ending up at the same threat actor? And so there's various reasons for that at the moment. But as I said, so they're known as Chinoxy, Bookworm. So they've got some known targets which are pretty straightforward. So India, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And generally what they're looking for or targeting in those areas is anything government or political in nature. So some of the other lures we've seen from Red Hariasa in the past have all been about when they're targeting Vietnam, it'll be things about government sign off on telecommunications equipment, etc. I think once we saw a sign off for a SORM document, and that was a Russian document for their legal intercept. Now we suspect the threat actor just grabbed that and weaponized that as well. But in any case, they're always after espionage type data, so fairly straightforward on that front. In this case, they straight up just went and stole the document, the finance minister's .rtf. It was pretty much word for word taken from a news outlet. So straight up plagiarism right there. In this case, instead of using 0798, they used a pretty common 11882. Now most of this stuff should be patched, but we still see them using it, so that must mean they're getting some success out of it. In this case, the targets were in Kyrgyzstan. And so if we walk through this particular scenario, one of the interesting factors for this one is that when they used the 8.t builder, so they created their document, so they'd copy and pasted the text from the website. But what they'd done is they'd accidentally left in the Chinese language pack that they used to create it. So that's a fairly dead giveaway. Could be a false flag, but given some of the targeting and other things in this threat actor, it's a fairly nice kind of indicator there. This malicious document utilizing 1188.2, so that's again spear phishing. Victim opens the document. This triggers the CVE. In this case, rather than shellcode, just remote code execution. And what happens again is 8.t is written out to temp, so fairly straightforward. It's pretty easy to detect this stuff. That then results in this WFM, so WD32 PRSV SE.WFM. Now this isn't the final payload. This is just another stage in the loader. And what this does is it goes through and runs a few decoding routines, which result in 2 documents getting written out. So the first one is this confax.exe, and the other one is lbtserve.exe. In this case, lbtserve.exe is the actual payload. In this case, it's Chinoxy. So that's kind of how we were able to tie it back to Hariasa at this point. It also talks to 2 C2s, so it has like a fallback C2. But having a look at these C2s, where if you start to pivot around some of the IPs and then go from passive DNS from those IP addresses to other domains, you end up at a nice collection of Red Hariasa domains as well. So, we've got malware, we've got targeting that we know they're after, and we've got that. So that's how they traditionally have been doing it. These guys are still active at the moment. They're still targeting pretty much everything under the sun in those regions. So anything in the stands is pretty much up for game for them at the moment. So that's pretty interesting. So they're still pretty active. All right. So jumping through to Vietnam-based threat actors, we only track one at this point, and that's what we call Scarlet Avian. We used to call them Avian forever because we weren't confident enough that it was actually somebody who was based in Vietnam, because there was some crossover targeting. But in any case, other people call them Ocean Lotus or Sea Lotus. Man, you call them APT 32. From a targeting perspective, we see them go after, targets in China, the Philippines, Thailand, Cambodia, but also a bit of internal targeting in Vietnam itself. We've seen consumer markets and a few other targets in government and maritime. And again, they're traditionally after espionage type victims, or type intelligence rather. So this one was an interesting case. So I call it Scarlet Avian just because they used two lures, and I think they were trying to capitalize on some of the hype going on around the world with COVID. And so in this case, they used Chinese language documents, or Mandarin language documents, apologies. And the gist of those were, so the first one they tried was outbreak of H5N1, or N1 rather, which is avian flu, and apologies for the poor translate. That should be avian flu, not aviation flu. But in any case, so that was one from a couple of years ago. That's not something that's related to here, but when COVID was kind of first coming around, there was a lot of callbacks and throwbacks to that. So I can see why they would have used that lure. The second file name that we observed from them was a bit more of a straightforward one. So coronavirus update, China is tracking travelers from Hubei. The lure document itself was obfuscated, but then when you opened it and executed it, you would end up with this New York Times article that they've just taken and again copy and pasted. So it's not very inventive. It's fairly straightforward, taking a news article and putting it in there. But I can see why somebody might want to click that and read it. New York Times is sometimes paywalled as well, so that could potentially increase people's wanting to open it. So the scenario for this one is pretty interesting. So they go away. In this case, they don't actually make a malicious document. It's classic, and this has been happening since like 2010 or probably even earlier. The threat actors pulled a RAR file together. It's got a .exe, it's got a malicious DLL. You can kind of see where this is going already. They then package that RAR up, attach it to an email, send it to a victim. The victim then opens that, extracts the files, and then executes the .exe. I don't know why you would do this. I certainly wouldn't open a .exe from a random email unless I knew it was coming. So, but apparently it works for them. On execution, you get a decoy document, which is the New York Times article from before. So you've opened it. Yeah, okay, now I get a document. Okay, that's kind of more like what I was expecting. In the background, however, you've got crypt.dll. It's getting run. So that's the DLL that was attached to it. This has basically a couple of stages. The first stage is it goes away and decrypts some shellcode, which then runs and drops out another DLL from inside this binary. This is using an encryption method, and I always mispronounce this, but it's Shikata Gana. Now this DLL inside there decrypts some more shellcode, which then builds out the final payload, which is the DLL. And so once that's actually run and executed on the system, you end up with a DenesRat, which starts talking to this libjs inquirejs.com. Now, some of the stuff we see from Scarlet Avian is around, their domain structure is really designed to make it blend in and appear as if that traffic should be normal. So, if we have a quick look at this domain, I would probably go, oh, okay, well, it's a library.js and it's, JavaScript, etc. So potentially it's a legitimate query. All of that is just to hide underneath some of the network traffic that you would normally see in a network. So that was pretty interesting. It's not often these days that we see, RAR or zip files be attached. It's fallen by the wayside, especially from a China-based threat actor perspective. But Vietnam still seems to be getting some mileage out of that. All right. So jumping down to the subcontinent. So this is the last two we'll talk about. We have a threat actor we call Orange Athos. Other people might be more familiar with them as Hangover Group or Patchwork. We've been keeping an eye on these guys for a pretty long time. It's fairly easy to keep an eye on them. Some of the techniques they use are they repeat all the time, and so it's kind of a nice way to keep an eye on them. From a targeting perspective, United States, but more focused, I guess, on near neighbors on the subcontinent, Bangladesh, Pakistan, South Korea, Sri Lanka. To be honest, most of the stuff we see from our Orange Athos is usually targeted at Pakistan, which is a dead giveaway as to who's probably behind it. So that's fairly easy for us. What we tend to see from a targeting sectors perspective is things like aviation, especially defense, aviation, etc. Anything to do with like military, so Navy, Air Force, Army, etc. They're usually on there. And we've seen a smattering of other things, so financial services, government, media, NGO. Some of that, we're not quite sure if it's been collateral or if it's actually been specifically targeted. And again, another espionage threat actor, so really after intelligence collection. So this is a kind of a really cool one. They sent through a document, Ministry of Health directive from the National Health Commission of People's Republic of China. Fairly straightforward. You'd open this, you'd probably go, oh, okay, right, well, I should probably fill this out if you're a good Chinese citizen. It's asking for specific details on any trips to Wuhan in a period of 15 days. Interestingly enough, this one isn't really about executing macros, and I'll step you through what it looks like. So they go away, they build this malicious document. I would also point out here that poorly worded content. When we had a Mandarin linguist have a look at this, they were pretty much like they probably could have gotten this from Google Translate rather than it have been written by a native speaker. So that's kind of another dead giveaway here. And we see that a fair bit with some of the Orange Athos lures. In any case, spear phishing, as per normal, victim opens the document, and instead of having a macro enabled, the document basically asks you to fill it out, and then click a button. And when you click the button, it goes submitting, and then it opens up a download file, calls out to GitHub, and goes from there. But one of the things that goes wrong here is the way they've done that is that it opens that download box 5 times, so the user gets multiple editions of go through and download this file. So a little bit of a dead giveaway that probably something isn't right. If you were to continue and download that, you would download a file called submit details. That's written to disk. When that's run, it comes up and says in Mandarin, hey, you've submitted your details. But in the background, this binary is writing out 2 things, A.bat and Tencent Cloud service. And what that does is the A.bat basically makes sure that Tencent Cloud Service runs, and it enumerates a bunch of information, host names, usernames, all that kind of stuff, all the juicy things you need to profile a victim, and then sends that off to a command and control server. So this one's interesting. I'm pretty sure the GitHub got taken down fairly quickly. If you were to go and have a look at some of the other Tencent Cloud Services.exe, you'd actually find references where they've tried to make that binary look really legitimate. And so there are things like, so previously in this, just jumping back a second, so this was the National Health Commission. So you had NHP, TAC.gov, etc., and a few other things like that to kind of make it look realistic when you were going through if you were to look at it under some static analysis. So they did try, but at the same time, opening 5 times at a download box is probably not gonna give you some success there. So if we step through to the final threat actor, now this is the opposite side of the spectrum. This is a Pakistan-based threat actor we call Green Havildar. Some other folks might know them as Havildar team. We merged them in with their crime gang that they have, Gorgon Group as well. Just for us, it's we don't see any point differentiating them because the activity we see, while slightly different, is still done by the same folks. From a targeting perspective, India, obviously, the United States, Russian Federation, Spain. So those last 2 are odd ones, but that's usually associated with some of the Gorgon Group activity. From a target sector perspective, defense, government, security, anything like that, pretty much the same as Orange Athos previously. So this one here, we actually managed to get the email for, which is always really nice. So you can see that it's from the duty officer of the navy.gov.india. That was spoofed, but it was targeting folks like gov.india, nic.india, and iaf.india. And essentially that had an attachment, which was this guidelines.xlma. And so if we walk through this, this ends up in a crimson rat, which is pretty much unique to green Havildar. They go away, they weaponize their guidelines.xlma using a malicious user form. They send the spear phishing email to the number of people that they've got on there. What happens from there is the victim enables macros because everybody just seems to enable macros these days. But what happens in this one is it's really cool. So they've got this numerical array which has I as a delimiter, and basically it goes through and reconstructs this binary. And so the macro writes out this .exe. I'm not even going to try and say that out. Drops it into C programs into that file. And then that is basically crimson rat from straight away. So they've got execution, they go away, enumerate things, log keystrokes, grab some screen captures. At the same time, they're killing any processes for AV, anything like that, and going from there. And then that's communicating back to a command and control server that we've kind of attributed to green Havildar. So that's some of the COVID lures we've seen APT use. To be honest, a lot of those lures were at the very beginning of COVID, and as we kind of get towards now, they tend to slow down a little bit, and we haven't seen too many. But hopefully, you gain some insight and some knowledge on what threat actors have been doing from a COVID perspective. Yeah, happy to take any questions.
Oh, that's great, Jason. Really informative. It's really interesting. I suppose not in a good way, but to just see exactly what is going on out there. So I've learned a lot today. So thank you for that. So moving into the questions, we've had a few questions come in, but just to say to the people that are obviously on, it's your opportunity to ask any questions now to get them answered before the end of the webinar. But one of the first questions we've had in is, are you tracking any UK or US based groups?
Look, so we see a lot of activity. Some of that activity we can kind of work out where they're based at, others we don't. So there's the potential that we're tracking it, but currently not to my knowledge.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. And moving on to the second question. So are we seeing a return to normal, like non-COVID-19 lures by threat actors at all?
Yeah, I would definitely say from an APT perspective, we've seen a much more return to, I guess, a normal tempo, and I guess more of a focusing on what's in the media currently. Unfortunately, we can't get away from COVID in the media, but there's a lot of more juicy things going on at the moment. The US election, there's a whole bunch of other things that have been used for lures, etc. So I definitely think we're seeing a lot less. We're back during the main part of the pandemic. The PwC ourselves, we were running daily threat updates, and we were getting quite a lot of lures from threat actors, whether that be cybercrime or whether that be espionage focused. We tailored that off towards the end of September just because we weren't seeing a significant amount of traffic on that. I would say there is still a lot of cybercrime and organized crime gangs using the invoice and what with a COVID slant to them. Anything to do with like HMRC tax breaks, etc. We've seen a bunch of Canadian versions of that as well, and Australian, etc. So I would definitely say that from an APT perspective, yeah, it's turned down. Organized crime is still kind of going at it fairly high, but I would say that's dropped down as well.
That's great. Thank you very much. And as I say, please keep those questions coming in, and if Jason answers your question and you need to ask another part to it, please feel free to put that through as well. So moving on to the next question, were there any that targeted UK-based government or companies?
Oh, off the top of my head, the closest one would be some of the Black Banshee stuff I spoke about before, AstraZeneca, UK, University of Oxford. Whether it was targeting them or whether they was used as an interesting domain to click on is something we're yet to determine. I definitely think we saw some targeting, but off the top of my head, I can't exactly remember those details. But if you want to hit me up afterwards, I can definitely have a look for you.
That's great, thank you. So for the person that obviously asked that question, if you did want to get in touch with Jason afterwards, or you can put it through the marketing email, so marketing@crest-approved.org, and we can obviously pass that all on to Jason, so no problem at all. So moving on to our next question. So have we seen any other threat actors outside of the ones in your presentation using COVID-19 lures?
Yeah, so we have seen some Iran-based threat actors use and target, I guess, pharmaceutical executives. They weren't specifically using COVID lures, but they were targeting executives that would have access to some of that information. Outside of that outlier, we didn't see too much, but I mean that covers off the majority of them. So apart from that Iran outlier, most of the big players are accounted for.
Great, thank you very much for that one. So this is quite an interesting one. So have we seen pen testing internal security teams using COVID lures?
Yeah, so I think we have seen one or two of them, and I think from our perspective at least, we tend to, when we're doing pen testing, we tend to avoid doing that because I think it dilutes some of the message and I guess can cause some collateral damage in that sense. But we have definitely seen some pen testing lures where we took one look at it and went, yeah, that's pretty much a pen tester rather than a threat actor itself. So it has happened. It hasn't been too common, but yeah, definitely out there.
Great, thanks for that. So a question that's just come in. So why are there no cyber criminal threat actors in Western countries?
Oof. Hard question to answer. I suspect there are, and I suspect our colleagues over at NCA, etc., would probably have a who's who of those lists. I guess a lot of the affiliate schemes, etc., that are run and that we see doing ransomware and cybercrime, etc., they are generally, Russian speaking and out of there. But that's not to say that Western people aren't in there or participating in that. So I wouldn't say there aren't any. I think the focus and the bulk of the activity has come from Russian-based forums, etc. So hopefully that answers that question.
Great, thank you very much. So if you have got any other questions, please pop them in. But I'd just like to pass this on, Jason, to you. So it's not a question, but it's a really huge thank you for your presentation. They said that it's been very informative. So cool. It's always good to get that feedback, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Excellent. So I don't think we've had any other questions come in. As I say, this is your last chance while I'm talking away, and thanking Jason so much for that presentation today. So as I say, I think people have taken a lot away from what you've said today, and I definitely have. So thanks for that, and thank you to all the attendees that have made the effort to come along today. So it is really much appreciated. So I'll just pass over to Jason to just say a last couple of words to you.
Yep, cool, thanks very much. Like I said, if anybody has any questions, I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter, etc. So if you want to ask any questions, fire away from there as well. But thank you.
Come in, Deb, if you want to ask that before we go.
I've just got one that's literally just sneaked in there before we went away. So just a quick one for you, Jason, here. So how do you see deep fake technologies being used by threat actors?
Interesting. So I guess from our perspective, the deep fake is more around misinformation and that aspect rather than being used for actual kind of malicious threat actor activity. I wish my colleague Louise Taggart was here because she'd probably have a really good answer for you on this front. But from a malicious activity, we haven't really seen any, and I probably wouldn't expect to see any. But from a misinformation, disinformation aspect, I think there's probably a lot of potential there. But I think at the moment, like I've seen some deep fakes and been able to kind of easily identify it. So I think once I see a really good one, then I'll start to be a bit worried about it.
Excellent, thank you. So we will close it there, but the only thing is I will say, Jason, that obviously you've mentioned Louise now, so now we're going to have to get you to do a joint presentation webinar, aren't we, in the future?
Yeah, definitely.
So I think that's the next one on our list. So yeah, once again, thank you, Jason, for your presentation today, and thank you to everybody who attended. It is really appreciated, and hope everybody goes away and has a really good rest of the day. Okay, so take care. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.